We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello, I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. This week's Planet Holyrood is a bit of a right-wing takeover. We've got both our guests from the Scottish Daily Express, Ben Borland and his evil sidekick, Douglas Dickie.
I think it's the other way about, actually.
Thanks for joining me, chaps.
Pleasure.
So, Holyrood's in recess this week, and so the Scottish Press Pack was in London, basically building contacts and networking, which is code for boozing and scoffing the free buffets. One of the politicians that they got time with was the Prime Minister, and he was keen to respond to the First Minister's suggestion that an outright SNP victory next year would lead to Indy Ref 2. Keir Starmer said, and I quote, "He's insulting the intelligence of Scottish people." So it seems to me that we're no further forward on Indy Ref 2 compared to SNP conference, regardless of the result next year. It's just not going to happen, is it?
Well, I don't know. It's not going to happen primarily because the SNP aren't going to win a majority. I still think, and I think the position has always been a majority one party, like Salmond achieved in 2011, would make it very politically difficult to say no for the UK government. It would, and that's been the bar that's set. The SNP's never managed to clear that bar since. To me, all Swinney's done is set out what we all already knew anyway, which was that if the SNP can somehow manage to win a majority, then they would have a much stronger, I'm not saying it would be unanswerable, but it would be a much stronger case for saying we've got a mandate for a second referendum. Whether Starmer would agree or not, I don't know. But I think it's all academic because the SNP just aren't going to win another.
I mean, the polls show them nudging up, though. So when Swinney took over, I think they were expecting, this is a sort of extrapolation of the polls from the time that he took over, they were in their sort of late 30s. Now they're expected to get about 60. So they really are going up at the expense of Labour and the fracture in the pro-UK vote. So they're not that far off it in terms of the polls.
No, I mean, I just think as polling day gets close and the campaign proper starts, the focus will switch to the SNP's record, and the record's dreadful in virtually every department, apart from paying lots more benefits, which nobody can afford.
I think as well, you talked there about how the SNP, the polls have went from kind of high 30s to
well, no, sorry, extrapolation of seats. Yeah, rather than...
That's what I mean. But the actual poll hasn't moved. They're still sitting on with 35%. The only reason that they're moving up is because of this fracture in the unionist vote. There seems to be some suggestions this week. I've seen that maybe the reform, reform have plateaued a bit early in Scotland. I think Nigel Farage's vow that they were going to fight all 73 constituency seats might come back to kind of haunt them. They'd be much better maybe focusing on certain areas. Which
would be amazing for Labour. I mean, that would just be if they decided not to contest every first past the post seat, particularly in the Central Belt.
Exactly,
that would be a gift for Labour.
And I think that's ultimately, as Ben says, I've said it on here a million times. As we get closer and closer, and there's a bit of me almost doesn't really want to hear Keir Starmer indulging them by even getting involved in this debate. Like, focus on those devolved issues, which is what this, what this election should be about. Obviously, people can vote for whatever reason they want, but it should be on devolved issues. And I think by even kind of engaging in this conversation, it almost legitimises the SNP's argument. And sometimes I wish we would just say, look, this is a devolved election about the NHS, about public services, about transport, about policing, about crime, all about housing, all these things. It's not about independence, and just stop playing their games. I know people say it was 11 years ago, but you can't just always have this threat of the referendum, always having an idea that we could have a referendum every 5 years. The country can't move forward in that. And at some point we need to just park this and do what we can within the constitutional framework there is. And I just think sometimes it should be ignored. Although
I'm conflicted. I mean, part of me thinks that given how momentous an issue it is, that the Scottish people are entitled to know the route to a referendum, whether that is like sustained support of around 60%, it's codified like the Good Friday Agreement. I know folk don't like a comparison between Northern Ireland and Scotland. So part of my brain says that. Another part of my brain says, why should pro-UK parties help move forward a referendum an inch when they think it would be such a catastrophe for Scotland? And given that the SNP are in a hole just now in terms of explaining to their supporters what a credible route is to Indy F2, why should the pro-UK parties essentially throw them a spade to help them get out of that hole?
I think the other thing that voters need to remember is when he's made this very explicit, a vote for the SNP is a vote for another independence referendum. And there are lots and lots of people out there who vote SNP and don't necessarily want a referendum, or would probably vote no if one came along, because they like the sort of centre-left policies. They think, stick with what you know, better the devil you know. I think to all of those people, the message now needs to be, if you don't want an independence referendum, do not vote for the SNP, because there's still a majority of people who not only don't want a referendum, would vote no in one. So to avoid that, I've never really got my head around the kind of the soft SNP supporters who don't seem to realise that the party's only reason for existence is breaking up the United Kingdom. It's not to
You mean
make
like the sort of
schools
salmon
better.
voters in 2007 and
Yeah,
11?
well, if you're centre-left and you kind of like that, there's other parties you can vote for. You can vote for Labour, you can vote for the Lib Dems. But the only reason, really, and Swinney's clarified that very helpfully, I think.
I mean, at least he's been honest about it. Nicola Sturgeon
Yeah,
routinely would say, this isn't a vote, this isn't about independence. And then as soon as the election was over, she'd say, we've been given a mandate to chase a second independence referendum, so I'll give Swinney some credit at least.
Let's see if he sticks with it.
Yeah, well,
'Cause
that is
it might be a TV debate, as Sturgeon did a couple of weeks before the vote. Swinney's asked, what would you say to someone who likes the SNP but doesn't want independence? I vote SNP. But he can't say that now.
And if he sticks with it, what happens if we wake up morning after the election and we've got a pro-independence majority but not an SNP majority? Can you see him backtracking? And then suddenly
That's
very
the
much
thing.
being...
I mean,
suddenly he has
Yeah.
got a
Oh, no,
mandate.
yeah.
this position does delegitimise the Greens and Alapa, even though I don't think they're going to come close to winning a single seat. But if the SNP were to win 60 seats and the Greens win 9, there's a clear pro-Indy majority. Swinney's logic is that it's not a mandate for Indy F2. Will he soften that position during the campaign? I could kind of see that, but his problem is he's effectively codified it by this conference vote that it's very much all about the SNP winning majority, not just a combined majority with another party. I think where they're on slightly shaky ground is this phrase, it's your right to decide, because to all intents and purposes, what they're actually arguing is your right to decide repeatedly until you get the right result. That's what it's about. And yeah, I remember I asked Nicola Sturgeon, I can't remember if it was a press conference or if it was one-to-one, if there was Indy F2 and there was another no vote, can you just categorically rule out that we're not going to have Indy F3 at some point in the future? And she wouldn't do that. She said it's a matter for, the Scottish Parliament. And so it feels like it's just
It's
a
actually not a matter for
never-ending.
the Scottish Parliament.
But, yeah, exactly. Legally, that is the case. So people will just have this sort of dread and fear about a rolling series of referendums.
But you're absolutely right. But to take your point from earlier on, where people have a right, should people have a right to know what would trigger a referendum? Equally, on the other side, there should probably, if we're going to legislate and say, look, polling at 60% sustained over a course of 2 years, also we need to have a block to say, look, if a generation was promised last time, and it lasted about 18 months.
Not even that, according to Sturgeon's book.
Well, yeah.
Didn't even last a morning.
Day one. There needs to also be a period where you say, right, we're not going to debate this. We're not even going to discuss it for a period of 20 years, 25 years.
I remember discussing that very point. This was maybe like after the referendum 2015 with Ruth Davidson's people, and say, well, why did you not have in the Edinburgh Agreement this clause that's it dead for a generation or 20 years? And there was a fear that if it was spelled out like that, if there was a sort of finality, that might drive some soft nose into yes. Whether or not that would have materialised, I don't know. But very few countries will allow a rolling series of referendums on their own breakup. And whatever way you cut it, Scotland has had the right to decide, and it's self-determined to stay in the United Kingdom.
And I think people forget the United Kingdom is a sovereign nation which has a right to protect its territorial integrity. I think, in some ways, I think it's bonkers that we just seem to quite happily let British taxpayers' money be used to push for the literal disruption of the UK state. It's quite like
Scottish taxpayers' money as well.
Well, yeah, but British taxpayers' money as well. It's quite a unique situation because I can't imagine this happening. I just can't imagine it happening anywhere else in the world.
More or less, every large country in Europe's got a region that wants to break away, and this doesn't happen anywhere else apart from perhaps Spain. We've seen with Catalonia, but they handle things rather differently. But Germany, Italy, France, they've all got regions that have nationalist, separatist movements, and they don't get state funding and attention in the same way.
The SNP are a pro-independence party. They were elected by the people of Scotland. I don't really have a problem at all with them taking that stance in government. I mean, there's a debate on whether public money should be used for independence white papers. I guess where I draw the line is, should another government, either the UK government, an opposition party, somehow be coerced into implementing a policy in directory that they don't agree with? And that's where I think the SNP can be criticised, because if you think that a referendum is a terribly divisive thing and independence would be disaster, why would you help at all on that front? Well, you can recognise the SNP are the government, they can use their budget however they want, but the UK government doesn't have to help them out.
And despite what I said, it is only the SNP who think a majority would be a mandate. Labour don't have to agree. Nobody has to agree with that. I just think there has been a bar set that I think if the SNP win a majority, the only argument is that a generation hasn't passed, and it would be hard to say. Look, last time we got a majority, we got a referendum.
I'd also be wary. We talk about what would the trigger be. People always seem to say, 60% sustained for 2 years, whatever, as Ben mentioned. I wouldn't want to trust it on, find out now polls. Let's be,
measuring it is an issue.
Put it in
is it Survation? Is it YouGov? I mean,
maybe a Daily Express online poll might be a better judge. But I mean, how do you measure it?
It's a tricky one.
I think the other thing as well is, I think Starmer as well, when he was saying when he's taking Scottish people for fools, I think as well he was referring to the infamous secret plan, which is a novel political strategy to say, I've got a secret plan that will definitely work, but I can't tell anyone what it is yet.
I mean, there's only a few options. There's going back to court for another bite of the cherry, even though the Supreme Court have ruled conclusively that it's a reserved issue. That's a fool's errand. Trying to get support from the international community, who cares? Withdrawing cooperation in relation to Westminster, i.e. not passing legislative consent motions, whatever they're called these days. I just don't think it's going to move the dial. I mean, legally, the Westminster government has the trump card, and that is it. There's no secret plan. You either get an agreement with the UK government or you don't. And I am surprised at how many pro-independent supporters go along with this nonsense. It's, you know, they were marched up to the top of the hill by Nicola Sturgeon, marched back down again, and it does feel like the same thing is happening with John Swinney.
I think as well, when you talk about the international community, I mean, we've seen, you know, the SNP on X wailing and gnashing about the comments, you know, that independence would be a boost for Vladimir Putin. You know, they kind of don't like that. But, you know, the breakup, I don't think that's that controversial a statement, that the breakup of the United Kingdom would be a destabilising factor in the world, given the UK's role in
It's
kind of
clear
world
that
affairs.
Russia, Iran, North Korea are all actively campaigning for Scottish independence. Not for any sort of civic, political reason, to weaken the UK and to weaken NATO.
All right, second subject, the continuing row over the housing emergency in Glasgow. It's now getting increasingly bitter. Just to recap, the city is facing a £66 million black hole over a refugee homelessness situation. The SNP blame the Home Office in relation to the policy of trying to empty asylum hotels, and that's creating a sort of spiral effect of refugees claiming temporary accommodation in Glasgow. Labour say that not enough homes have been built, and also that decisions on housing laws passed at Holyrood have made the situation worse. Now, this row went into overdrive, I think, last week. The Scottish Labour MP, Joani Reid, who not someone known for walking away from a scrap, she tweeted, "The SNP are taking the biscuit. They chose to turn Glasgow into a sanctuary for asylum seekers through their own virtue signalling policies, and now they want the Home Office to bail them out. It's the same old story, grandstanding about compassion, then crying foul when the bill arrives. Real leadership means planning ahead and building enough homes, not blaming Westminster every time their own posturing backfires." Susan Aitken, the Glasgow council leader, poured petrol on that tweet by saying, "Is Joani Reid planning to defect to Reform?" So who's right?
Well, I mean, I think Joani Reid just summed up not just, you know, the SNP stance in this argument, but the SNP stance in many, many arguments. It's to bring in a policy that they think will make them look good to progressives around the world or progressives in the UK, and then mimp and moan when the reality of it hits home and try and blame Westminster. We've seen it time and time again, and this is just another example of it. And for Susan Aitken, it's just lazy. Oh, Reform Light, you know, Labour are just Reform Light now. I mean, it's just nonsense. It's just complete nonsense, and it's just. And in some ways, Joani Reid's walked into the trap. Right? In some ways, she's taken the bait, but I think she's absolutely spot on here. You know, the SNP have only got themselves to blame because of those laws. You know, everyone's entitled to, legally entitled to housing. Because of that, we're now seeing an influx of asylum seekers, coming up from England, putting pressure. I think, is it over 3,000 in Glasgow right now? Now, people might not think that's a massive number, but it's, it's the size of a small town, which requires all the, infrastructure of a small town. So it's no wonder it's putting pressure on Glasgow, and it's basically all so the SNP can pat themselves on the back and feel better about themselves. But, once again, the reality of the situation is it's Scottish taxpayers or British taxpayers who pay the price.
What's your view, Ben? Who's in the right on this one?
Joani Reid, 100%. I've been researching Joani Reid this morning. I have to say I'm very impressed with her. Obviously, her dad is a Scottish icon.
Late grandfather.
Was it a grandfather?
Yeah,
Sorry, apologies. Right. Yeah, of course. Grandfather's Scottish icon. I think
maybe her father's an icon as well. I don't know.
Yes, maybe he is. Yeah, actually, that wouldn't work. It couldn't be a dad, could it? Shows how thorough my research is. But yes, I think she's inherited a lot of that sort of straight talking, and I think, like her grandfather, I think she probably speaks for a lot of working class people here in Scotland. I was saying to Dougie, I'm just back from a city break in Lyon in France, and there was huge numbers of homeless people living in tents by the Rhone and in the parks in the city. and most of them appeared to me, I mean, obviously you can't tell, but a lot of them were clearly asylum seekers. So this idea that it's this sort of completely unacceptable for a country not to house everyone who arrives. Clearly, that's not happening in France. So people arrive in France, they don't have anywhere to live, and they live in a tent in the park. People arrive in Glasgow, they've got a legal right to a well-appointed flat, courtesy of the city council. Now,
in terms of asylum, it's a Home Office contractor, not the council. So I don't think it'd be fair to say that if you're talking about asylum seekers rather than refugees, asylum seekers, it's MERS.
Yes. Yeah.
But when an asylum seeker is granted leave to remain, they can then go for temporary accommodation in a local authority like Glasgow, and many of them do.
Well, they do, because there's no legal right in outside Scotland. So,
I mean, I think my view on this is that I don't think there's too many asylum seekers in Scotland, and I certainly don't think that asylum seekers get too much, as some people would say. I mean, they're effectively forced into unemployment, and they are marginalised to and that's a complete understatement. But if you look at it in the context of Glasgow, I think that both governments can be faulted here. The dispersal scheme is supposed to be national across Scotland now, and despite that fact, well over 90% of asylum seekers are placed into one city, Glasgow.
Is that not just a reflection of where there's available housing stock?
Well, I mean, MERS will try and secure private rented accommodation, other forms of accommodation. I did a story a few weeks ago. There are 0 asylum seekers in Fife or the Highlands. Are we really saying that there's no accommodation at all in these huge council areas?
Obviously, a lot of the asylum seekers in other council areas have been in hotels, and that policy is now coming to an end. The hotels are gradually being... And I think I read a response from MERS to a Westminster inquiry, and again they were saying it's the different rules in Scotland in trying to apply for a house of multiple occupation. It's much, much harder because the local community, the community council can say, oh, hang on a minute, and object. And clearly these objections are being put forward, and MERS is finding it hard to get housing anywhere else.
I just think they could do a lot more. I mean, it used to just be Glasgow, but now it's many more. But, Glasgow, if you look at the budgetary pressures, it's extraordinary, and we just need a fairer distribution of asylum seekers across Scotland. And at the same time, the laws that have been passed by Holyrood are making this situation a lot worse as well, because I think this is a law that predates Holyrood, but how can you have a situation where hundreds of asylum seekers who are granted leave to remain, or refugees granted leave to remain in London, are then applying for temporary accommodation in Glasgow? It just seems utterly ludicrous. I don't think it's too much to say that if you're granted leave to remain in London or Birmingham or Manchester, you then declare yourself homeless in the same city.
Yeah, but then, I mean, it's a bit like the argument that you should claim asylum in the first country you come to, which doesn't happen because clearly every single asylum seeker in the UK has passed through multiple safe haven countries and they haven't claimed asylum till they've arrived here. I mean, there are other options, but they're just never considered because they're deemed to be, right-wing reform. I mean, look at the Ukrainian resettlement scheme. We had Ukrainian people living on cruise ships in Glasgow and Edinburgh. Is that not an option? Find an old cruise ship? I mean, if it's acceptable for Ukrainian families fleeing war, surely it's acceptable for Somalian families fleeing war.
That covers the asylum side, but I mean, say you're granted leave to remain on one of these ships, what happens then if you don't have a house? Where should you be allowed to?
Well, you're going to go to Glasgow, aren't you? Or you're going to go to Scotland.
Yeah. If you're granted leave to remain, you can go anywhere in the UK.
But you're going to go to the place where you're guaranteed a house.
Yeah, I don't think you can stop people moving to Glasgow. What the SNP should do is repeal
Well, I mean,
they'd make it the same
even
as the rest
Glasgow
of the UK.
Council has asked for the Scottish Government to do that. They want a pause in the relevant legislation, which hasn't happened yet.
So what's Susan Aitken moaning about then?
Well,
You
I
know,
mean,
she's
can't
kind of having a go.
she can't pause it unilaterally.
Yeah.
She
Well,
requires
but
her.
she's already asked for
Her-
the
her
very
party
laws.
can
that
do
Jodie
it.
did.
Yes, no, exactly, and they're not doing it. I mean, she's asked several times. So, in terms of that aspect of it, that is a matter for the Scottish
So she
Government.
agrees with Joani Reid, and yet she's on.
Well, no, I think they disagree on the asylum aspect of it. I mean, Joani Reid's not criticising the Home Office. Susan Aitken is, but ultimately, I think yes, they both agree that there should be a pause in the homelessness legislation.
And so does that mean Susan Aitken's going to defect
She
to reform?
reform
Is she going to go to reform?
I can't see Susan Aitken defecting to reform. I certainly can't see Joani Reid defecting to
Well,
reform.
by
either.
the way, I'm just going to say one interesting kind of addendum to this, I suppose, is that I have seen, because obviously, Joani Reid's grandfather, Jimmy, I have seen SNP voters on X try and explain to Joani Reid what her grandfather would think of this and what he would, do, and how he would be an SNP supporter and whatnot. And that
I think he was at the time of his death, but is it a bit weird that people are held to account for views that their relatives
But also, I
kinda
think
wants
Joani Reid
held?
probably knows more about what her grandfather would want than some random Natbot on X.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not sure what my grandfather's views would have been, but it would be kind of weird to me if folk were saying, Alexander Hutcheon believed this, so why don't you believe that? It just seems completely irrelevant. But anyway, look, moving on, guys, your favourite political party, the Greens, seem to be doing quite well across the UK. They've got a new leader, is it Zack Polanski? Mm-hmm. The polls are showing that they might have a really good result at the next general election. The Scottish Greens, under fresh leadership of Ross Greer and Gillian Mackay, are also doing well in the polls. Why?
The English Green? Why the English Greens?
Yeah, well, I mean, why are both? I mean, the Scottish Greens are forecast to actually gain seats. The English Greens are forecast to have a really good result at the Westminster election. It just seems like there's something in the water.
I don't know what that is. I don't want any of it.
LSD, maybe. which they would, of course, legalise.
I think the Scottish Greens did vote for the legalisation of drugs at their recent conference, but they get a bad press, and yet whenever opinion polls come out, they seem to be doing a lot better than
a lot better.
caricatures.
I mean, from an extremely low, an extremely low starting point. I mean,
I think the Scottish Greens would get double figures.
I think
in terms
also
of
the
MSPs.
Scottish Greens are furious about John Swinney's independence campaign because it takes away the biggest element of their support, I think, which is SNP voters giving their second vote to the Greens on the list. I would say that's why they've done so well historically. And Swinney's now saying, both votes SNP, we've got to really force this. There's no point voting for the Greens because that's not going to help us get Indy Ref 2. That's a major blow for Ross Greer, and he was noticeably furious about it. I think
they're quite an attractive prospect to younger voters, though, on both sides of the border.
I think they're just the opposite side of the coin the Reform are on. I mean, it's a protest vote. It's a upset. I don't like the way things are going. I don't like the way the country's been governed. I'm going to vote Green. It's what you'd say if you're maybe younger, maybe obviously far more left of centre. It's the same motivation for people who vote Reform, just from the opposite direction.
It's very much part of the culture wars. Yeah. Voting Green. They say that the right are cultivating culture wars to win power. The Greens cultivate those culture wars as well from the opposite side. I also note how people call Reform far right all the time. Why aren't we calling the Greens far left?
Well, you do.
Well, we do,
but yeah, the BBC don't.
Yeah, it's just. I've said it many times. I still think the Greens would be far better off if they stuck to being green, and not
that's
indulging themselves in these culture wars. That's
nonsense. The one thing that never seems.
Well,
to mention.
they're a social justice party.
But what's depressing for me is I think in England they were very much still focused on the environment. They obviously had their views on kind of social issues and whatnot, but until quite recently, they've been still very much an environmental party. And I think this is Zack Polanski's dipping his toe.
I think that's a very good point. They're following the Scottish Greens, who've gone from the party of Robin Harper and an environmental party, Andy Whiteman, really environment first and foremost, to being a social justice party, and we just hang the trendy environmental green label on themselves.
And I think they found in Israel and Gaza and whatnot, I think they found a topic that is resonating with a certain demographic, age group, if you like. And I think that's why they're polling okay now. Again, when push comes to shove, I just don't see how the Greens can gain seats when Reform are going to win seats on the list, and that's going to push the Greens down. Reform are going to win more votes than the Greens according to the polls. I don't understand the arithmetic behind that, how the Greens add to their number when you've got another party going to take seats on the list.
Well, I mean, maybe Reform just take them from the Tories.
But that's not really how the list works, is it?
Still, if you go down...
The Tories are still polling higher than the Greens. Labour are still polling higher, and even the Lib Dems are polling around about the same as the Greens. I struggle to see the arithmetic around that.
Next year, see it. Time after time in Scottish elections, tactical voting will come to the fore, and the party that's most likely to beat the SNP will do very well.
And they do benefit massively from nationalists who want to game the system, who've worked out, we can get an independence majority if we lend the Greens our vote. Time and time again, when it's a straight choice at a general election, the Greens poll dreadfully. So, when it's that kind of binary choice, they don't do well. But when it's a chance to mix things up at Holyrood and maybe push the one policy that the Greens and one policy that the Greens and the SNP agree on, I think an awful lot of nationalist voters have taken that opportunity.
You made the point, Ben, that you sort of liken the Greens to Reform, and I would agree with you to the extent that Reform's social media, as much as I find the messaging reprehensible, is extremely impressive. Some of their videos, some of their social media content is really quite impressive, and the same has to be said for Zack Polanski's social media content over the last couple of weeks. They're just they
Was he not
nail
an
it.
actor? At one point, has he not got a background in drama? So
Was he not a hypnotist?
is it a hypnotist?
Something like that.
A performer. Then he was some sort of performer.
That doesn't fill me with massive confidence that a political leader was a former hypnotist.
But of course they are completely separate from the Scottish Greens. It's probably important to point that out. You're not voting for Zack Polanski next year. You're voting for Ross Greer and Gillian Mackay. So I can see...
Who are probably likely to be the kingmakers, let's face it.
Potentially. I can see the two parties maybe... I know they split over the they had an understanding, and then the transgender stuff, the English party weren't quite as fervent on it, and there was a split. I can maybe see them moving a bit closer together.
Yeah. I mean, it would be nice to see an actual Green Party launched.
A Green Party of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, just a straightforward, environmentally friendly party.
Isles and beaches.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think is there not an ecology party or something like that? I don't know. But I think I'm not saying that their time has come, but I think the Scottish Greens will do better than people expected.
You're saying that the kingmakers, do you think they would? I mean, we know Lorna Slater was sort of hinting that under her and Patrick Harvey's leadership, they would happily do a deal with Labour.
I mean, Ross Greer's on the record saying he wants to be back in government, and that would be with the SNP, not Labour. So
Labour. So he
not
wouldn't
Labour. No,
wouldn't do a deal with Labour.
He says there's too many issues on which they disagree for that to be a reality. But yeah, he's quite openly.
I mean, Ross Greer's never
to
been
be
in
minister.
government, so he would need to be in government first to return to it.
I mean, Ross Greer. Remember, he was in Yes Scotland. He worked closely with people like Shirley Ann Somerville. He's got the relationships there. He just doesn't have those with Labour. And he is right in the sense that if you want to implement your policies, you have to be in government. You can sometimes get concessions and amendments passed if you're in opposition, but the best thing to do is to be in government. Obviously, to be a success in government is better than to be a failure like Lorna Slater was. Well, but I think you've got the right idea.
Well, yeah. I mean, the last SNP Green coalition went so well. I can't imagine why voters wouldn't want another one.
Might end up being that way.
God, can you imagine?
Although, I mean, would John Swinney want them back? I'm not
I
convinced.
think that's maybe more.
Stephen Flynn certainly wouldn't want them back.
Yeah, I mean, Swinney's shown the SNP can cope with a minority government. They've done it time and time again. I'm sure that would be.
Just to ask you, Paul, then, you said it's better to be in government. You can only be in government.
Is this a usual something
This
with the
is-
Lib Dems in 2010?
This is my usual. So Nick Clegg, right, in 2010, went to coalition.
That's a good question. Probably right to go in, but wrong in the terms in which he went in.
I think
That's the way I'd fudge it.
I think giving up the tuition
can't
fees
stand
stuff was probably a tactical error, but
Yeah, no, the Lib Dems in 2010, not a good thing.
although they, Alec Cole Hamilton says they're going to make a big breakthrough. He says he could be the
He
kingmakers.
wants to be Deputy First Minister, yeah.
Well, I mean, that would be the obvious Labour Lib Dem coalition.
They're not going to have close to
I mean,
65 seats, though, are they? It's just, I think that's a bit of a fantasy.
But could they have more than the SNP?
Well, but then they would. You mean like more than the SNP and the Greens?
Well, that's the question.
who knows? I think there's
Well,
a
it's
lot
more
to
than the
play for.
SNP. You just need more. You need to be the to get first dibs at putting together a formal or informal coalition.
You've either got the numbers or you don't, and it becomes clear what that is after the election. I mean, Labour are up against it. There's still a narrow path for Anas Sarwar to be First Minister, but that path, as I say, is narrowing by the day.
Well, you need to get the Daily Record backing them. On a good Labour
Well,
paper.
we will look at the choice at the time, and then obviously we will
all guns-
consider it very carefully.
all guns blazing.
How about you guys?
Keep the red banner flying.
Tories or reform?
Tactical voting's
Yeah.
always been our strategy.
Absolutely.
Would that include reform?
Well, we'll need to make a decision on who is best placed to beat the SNP.
On that note, thanks again to Ben and to Dougie for joining me. You can listen to this episode of Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or you can watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.